Hi, I'm Alex from the Zscaler Customer Success Engineering team. In this series of short videos, we're taking a look at the baseline recommendations for the configuration of the Advanced Cloud Sandbox. This is the final part 2, Cloud Sandbox policies. Before we take a look at the recommended policies, let's first understand how sandbox policies work. First, you need to understand that rule order is top-down. That means the first rule will be evaluated, and if matched, no further rules will be evaluated. If not matched, then rule number 2 will be evaluated, and so forth and so on. Next, policy can be granular based on several controls: file types, URL categories, users, groups or departments, locations and location groups, or protocols. Next, let's discuss the various sandbox actions that can be taken by the policy. First-time actions are applied when the file is unknown to the sandbox. These include allow and do not scan, which forwards the file without any analysis. This is functionally equivalent to disabling the sandbox and is not recommended. Allow and scan, which forwards the file to the users but performs out-of-band analysis. If the file is later deemed to be malicious, a patient zero event will be generated. Quarantine, which holds the file from the user until after a verdict is returned. This is very secure since it eliminates the risk of patient zero events. However, it is disruptive to workflows. And for customers who have the browser isolation and advanced sandbox modules combined, there's also a quarantine and isolate action, which only works for PDF and Office files, and will quarantine the file, but display it in an isolated browser for the user to read while waiting for a verdict to be returned. An important thing to note is for the allow and scan and quarantine actions, there's the option to enable AI instant verdict. This is an MLAI pre-scan that determines the likelihood of the file being malicious. This improves user experience by allowing ZIA to automatically determine if a file should be quarantined or outright blocked. The second set of actions that can be configured are actions for subsequent downloads, which are applied when the file is already known to the sandbox. These include allow, which allows known malicious files matching whatever rule is configured through. Again, this is functionally equivalent to disabling the sandbox and is not recommended. And block, which will block known malicious files matching whatever rule is configured. Now that we have a basic understanding of how sandbox policies work, let's take a look at the Cloud Sandbox workflow. First, when the user attempts to download a file, the cloud effect is checked. This involves checking the hash of the file against known malicious and known benign files that have been sandboxed in all tenants and all clouds. If the file is not known to be malicious or benign, we move on to the next step, a pre-filtering scan, where a sample is scanned using engines optimized to identify bad behavior. If instant verdict is enabled, this will allow the sandbox to make the decision to quarantine or block the file based on the pre-scan results. Next, we move on to what's called the behavioral analysis, or the actual sandboxing process, where the file is sent through the detection pipeline and detonated inside a VM to determine whether it's malicious or not. Finally, once a verdict is determined, the threat database is updated so that all other customers can benefit from the cloud effect as well. Next, let's talk about how you should build a policy. The important thing to understand with a sandbox policy is that, as with all things in security, there's a trade-off between user productivity and user experience and security. The ideal sandbox policy should balance security and productivity by never allowing patient zero infections, while simultaneously never interrupting user productivity by making sure that they can still download most files without having to wait for a quarantine result. With this in mind, it's important to understand that your organizational risk tolerance will fundamentally alter how you approach building a sandbox policy. If your organization is very risk averse, for example, investment banks, law firms, or government agencies, you may find that you want to build a policy that includes a quarantine action for more URL categories and more file types. Conversely, if you have a tech-savvy user base where time is of the essence, such as in IT or academic research, engineering, recruiting, sales, R&D, and so forth, then you will want to configure a quarantine on fewer URL categories and fewer file types to make sure that the user experience is not negatively impacted. With that in mind, let's take a look at a model policy for a couple of scenarios, high risk and low risk. First, here's the high risk tolerance model policy. Let's work our way from the top to the bottom of this list of rules. First is rule number 1. We have a rule that quarantines high risk file types from suspicious and risky destinations for all users. The file types selected for this are executables, Android packages, all Microsoft Office file types, PDFs, and zips containing suspicious scripts. For the URL categories, here we've selected URL categories that are suspicious or risky. For example, the miscellaneous, illegal or questionable, security, and adult material supercategories, plus the web host, file host, and shareware download categories. This will make sure the policy is not applied to legitimate business destinations. Here, the action configured is quarantine, and we select all protocols and make sure our subsequent action is set to block. This will ensure that if an executable file, Office document, or other high-risk file type from those destinations is downloaded by any user, that file will be quarantined. The user will be forced to wait 2 to 10 minutes in order to be able to get their file, but this gives us the maximum amount of security while ensuring the disruption is minimal, since this rule will only apply for set file types and only on suspicious or risky destinations. The rule below this is a more permissive rule to ensure that IT help desk personnel and other admins who need to access applications are able to download these applications without quarantine. Here, we're targeting the IT help desk role, or whatever your IT admin role is within your organization, and only file types in the executable category. However, our URL categories are set to all, and our first-time action is set to allow and scan. The result of this, since the policy order is top-down, is that any executable that comes through from a risky destination for any user, including IT, will be quarantined. And then for IT help desk personnel, if the file comes from any remaining category not included in the first rule, so legitimate business destinations, since all risky categories were selected for the first rule, then that file will be allowed and scanned instead. Finally, we have our default behavior configured for all users. This rule will scan all other file types for everyone. Here, you could include all file types, since executables and other high-risk file types will already get rules 1 or 2 applied to them. URL categories should be set to all, and here, our first-time action should be allow and scan with AI instant verdict. This means that a pre-scan will happen when the file is first seen, and then if the risk score calculated for the file is deemed to be very high, the file will be sent to quarantine or blocked outright depending on whether it's deemed to be likely or very highly likely to be malicious. This policy minimizes disruptions to your users by making sure that most files from most destinations have the allow and scan action configured, allowing your users to download their files without disruption. This will also make sure that high-risk files, or files that seem particularly likely to be malicious, are quarantined during a scan or outright blocked, making sure that you have maximum security coverage with minimum disruption. One thing to note, rule number 4 here at the bottom of the list, is the actual default pre-configured sandbox rule, and we don't want that one to apply to any of our traffic since it provides less protection than the one we've configured. So make sure that our scan everything rule is above this rule. Finally, since this policy includes an allow and scan with AI instant verdict rule, it's important to go to administration alerts and configure patient zero alerts to make sure that your SOC or other security teams are notified if your user downloads a file that is later found to be malicious, and you can take appropriate remediation actions. Here's the same model policy, but adjusted for lower risk tolerance. Here, our default behavior is no longer set to allow and scan, but to quarantine. This means that all files that are not explicitly configured with a looser level of security will be subjected to a quarantine. The AI instant verdict option here will allow the files to be blocked instantly without the user having to wait for a verdict if they're very highly likely to be malicious. To go with this, and to minimize the impact on user experience, you'll want to create multiple business exception rules at the top of the policy list. Each rule will target a specific group for specific file types and one or more URL category that you'll have created that contains trusted websites. These rules are configured to have a first-time action of allow and scan. This means that if a file download matches this rule, i.e. it comes from a trusted website for specific groups for specific file types, it will be allowed through while being scanned in parallel. To make sure there's no negative impact on the security of your users' data and corporate environment, it's important to make sure that the sites you select for these custom categories are genuinely safe. By combining these two types of rules, we make sure that there's a default quarantine action, which is very secure, but also that for files that need to be downloaded without users having to wait, there is a way to configure an exemption, thereby minimizing the disruption on user workflows. And again, it's vital that you configure patient zero alerts to make sure that your SOC or security teams are alerted in case files are allowed through and then later found to be malicious during the parallel scan. That's it for this video covering advanced sandbox policies. Thank you for watching.